Good morning, I'm Taylor Wilson, and today is Wednesday, August 13th, 2025. This is USA Today's The Excerpt. Today, National Guard troops have arrived in D.C., plus how Trump's history with real estate shapes his presidency, and America's farmers are aging. Members of the Washington, D.C. National Guard reported for duty across the nation's capital yesterday under President Donald Trump's orders to fight crime and reduce homelessness in the city. Among those deployed were members of the Guard's 273rd Military Police Company, whose commanders shared images on social media of armored Humvees parked next to the Washington Monument. Trump ordered 800 members of the Guard into service, though not all have been deployed yet. Because D.C. falls under federal control, the president has the authority to call up the National Guard. He's also ordered that the city's Metropolitan Police Department be brought under Justice Department management. Mayor Muriel Bowser sought to reassure residents, saying that while violent crime remains a problem in the city, the National Guard deployment was unnecessary. Trump's decision to deploy the military has been criticized by Democrats across the country, who said the move raises civil liberties concerns at a time when crime in D.C. is actually dropping. From Washington to Ukraine and Gaza, President Trump's real estate history shapes his presidency. I spoke with USA Today White House correspondent Swapna Venugopal Ramaswamy for more. Swapna, thanks as always for joining me.
Oh, you're welcome, Taylor. Glad to be here.
A really fascinating piece from you here. How did we see Trump invoke some of these ideas with real estate in his latest moves in Washington surrounding, the military and police?
So earlier this week, when President Trump announced the federal takeover of Washington, D.C., he said he was going to send 800 National Guard troops there, and he described the capital as unsafe and dirty. And he also recalled an anecdote from his father. And his father himself was a real estate magnate in New York City long ago. And he said his father had given him a piece of advice, which was to judge the quality of a restaurant by its front door. So he said his father, Fred Trump, told him that if you see that the front door of a restaurant is dirty, it also means that the kitchen would be dirty as well. He basically began comparing Washington, D.C. to America's front door, saying if it's dirty, people won't respect the country. And he said something like, if our capital's dirty, our whole country is dirty, and they just don't respect it.
Well, Swapna, we know he's also been on this kind of really remodeling binge around the White House recently as well, right? Can you refresh us on how so, some of the recent moves he's made there?
Sure. So Trump has a new pet project, and that is the White House. So, in the 6 months since he's moved into the White House, the Oval Office is bathed in a sea of gold. So there are gold color appliques on the fireplace, there are gilded mirrors, there are antique, dessert stands and flower vases on the mantelpiece. There are, paintings of former presidents in ornate gold frames. There are so many flourishes that he's added, and most of them are golden color. And during a recent press conference with reporters from the cabinet room, he said he'd also outfitted the room with some ceiling medallions, and he'd brought in a grandfather clock that he happened to see in Secretary of State Marco Rubio's office when he went to visit the State Department. Apparently, it was so beautiful that he just had to have it. And so he brought it over to the cabinet room in the White House, and that's where it sits now. He has been busy redoing the Rose Garden. He's basically ripped up the sod in the Rose Garden, and he's going to be paving it with white stone. It's pretty much complete. I think it might be open any day now. He has, all these yellow and white umbrellas, like the ones from Mar-a-Lago. And of course, he has grand plans to design, or rather build, a 90,000 square foot ballroom in the East Wing. So he has some major real estate plans.
Yeah, he's been busy. We know he has this long past as a major real estate figure, Swapna. How do these moves, like some of the stuff we've been talking about, fall in line really with his approach to real estate historically?
I feel he basically sees real estate potential in everything pretty much. So just watching him in action, I've come to the conclusion that he uses, the lens of real estate to sort of orient himself around issues big and small. It could be, something like the Israel-Gaza conflict or the Russian-Ukraine war, and he would talk about it in terms of real estate. And I feel like it might be a process, it appears to be some kind of a process for him to sort of understand what's going on. He calls it a natural instinct, and he's always about like, he's trying to see if he can fix something up. So for him, it's a natural instinct, he says. So when he sees Gaza, which is a seaside Palestinian territory, he sees it as the Riviera of the Middle East. Or when he talks about Russian President Putin's war in Ukraine, he again describes in terms of, oceanside property that Russia has taken from Ukraine and how valuable the property is and how beautiful the property is. He describes the situation in those terms rather than things such as if there's going to be any help given to Ukraine or if there's going to be any sort of funding for Ukraine. None of that. He just zeroes in on the physical, land swaps, for instance. That's one topic he said he would talk about when he meets with Russian President Putin later this week, but he never talked about any security guarantees for Ukraine.
All right, great piece from you, Swapna. Listeners can go find the full version with a link in today's show notes. Swapna Venugopal Ramaswamy covers the White House for USA Today. Thanks, Swapna.
Thank you.
President Trump's nominee to be the new U.S. Commissioner of Labor Statistics recently suggested the agency stop issuing monthly jobs reports until the methodology used to compute the figures is changed. E.J. Antony is a Heritage Foundation economist who Trump tapped this week to replace the Bureau of Labor Statistics commissioner he fired. Antony earlier this month proposed the idea during an interview with Fox News Digital. He questioned the agency's methodology and economic assumptions because of recent jobs revisions, calling it a serious problem that needs to be fixed immediately. If confirmed by the Senate, Antony would replace Erica McIntyre, an appointment of former President Joe Biden, who Trump fired on August 1st. Trump accused McIntyre without evidence of manipulating data for political purposes. After the Bureau of Labor Statistics reported the U.S. added a disappointing 73,000 jobs in July. Trump also complained about revisions that reduced job gains in May and June and portrayed a much weaker labor market than Trump has touted. America's farmers are aging. What does that mean for our food system and for rural communities? I spoke with USA Today breaking news reporter Carissa Waddick for more. Thanks for hopping on, Carissa.
Happy to be here.
So let's just start with some of the numbers. How old are farmers and farm owners in the U.S.?
The average age of the American farmer is now above 57. Nearly 40% of all farmland across the country is owned by farmers over the age of 65. Both those numbers have been ticking up over the last couple of years.
And Carissa, how does what we're seeing now tie back to a farming crisis back in the 1980s, right?
Yes, the 1980s farming crisis was an economic downturn that altered the way young people thought about farming. At the time, a lot of parents on family farms discouraged their children from returning to the land that they worked on, returning to the family farm, because they didn't think that there was much value, they would make much money in it. At the time, a lot of families were selling their land or giving up their land. And so fewer people were going to agricultural schools, were learning from their parents, and that has kind of translated to today, fewer young people in the pipeline of farming leadership.
Yeah, you touched on some of the reasons there back in the 80s, but why are younger folks not wanting to turn to farming in this moment?
Young people who are part of this tradition of family farming, who are in these families, often worry about access to resources in the rural areas where the farms typically are. Things like good hospitals, and also they worry about benefits that you might get working at a 9-to-5 job in the public and private sector that you don't always commonly get on the farm. Things like health insurance. Economics is also a factor, and the lifestyle can be a lot of work. It's difficult. It's long hours, particularly in the spring and the fall. And especially for people who don't have those family connections and they want to get into farming, the startup costs are tremendous, from buying the land to buying all of the machinery you need to farm.
All right, so this aging farmer workforce, Carissa, what does all this mean for American agriculture and the nation's food supply?
Well, I talked to some experts and they gave some differing outlooks. Some say that this means an existential crisis on the horizon, while others took a more tempered approach and said it's not really clear yet if this is really a food security issue. The ones who said This is an existential threat, talked about how farmers who retire don't have anyone to pass their businesses on to typically, and they're more likely to sell that land. And it's not always clear what happens to that land, whether it gets turned into housing or is consolidated into larger farms. And those who said that we're not really sure if this will be a food security issue yet kind of pointed more to that consolidation. They said it seems like farms will be under larger owners, and we don't know yet what that will mean for food supply.
Well, Chris, we're functionally talking about folks in rural parts of the country for the most part. What does all this mean for rural communities?
I talked to an expert who said farms and family farms in particular are major economic drivers in rural communities. And so if they disappear, you also see local businesses in these rural areas really disappear as well. And it'll be a big hit for the rural communities that these farms are in.
Well, Chris, I know you wrapped this piece by outlining some, I guess, relative optimism here in the last few years. Can you talk through that a bit and just kind of what's next?
Experts by and large say that we need to get more young people into these farming pipelines, but they do have the reason for optimism. They see work addressing kind of these information gaps in younger farmers and increasing the financial assistance for these new farmers. One expert I talked to mentioned that the number of new farmers has jumped 11% in recent years. And in 2023, the number of agricultural graduates in the workforce grew by 3%, which is promising. Rutgers has a farming program for new farmers, and they had more than 500 people apply to participate in that program. A person who runs that I spoke with, and he said that that is some reason for optimism, that seeing rumblings of this getting more attention across the country, he just said that it needs to be treated with greater urgency, and more programs like this are needed.
All right. Carissa Wada covers breaking news for USA Today. Another great piece from you, Carissa. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much.
And coming up later today, scientists say novel ecosystems are our future, driven by climate change, land use shifts, and human movement. But in these reshaped environments, how do we tell the good guys from the bad?
We want to study them so that we understand how they function, who are the good guys and who are the bad guys in these environments. The upside is that there are some species that can help fill the role of some of these species that are going extinct.
Ecologist Corey Tarwater explains what Hawaii's freakosystem can teach us about resilience, biodiversity loss, and the surprising role of non-native species. That's today, beginning at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, right here on this feed. And thanks for listening to The Excerpt. You can get the podcast wherever you get your pods. And as always, you can email us at podcasts@usatoday.com. I'm Taylor Wilson. I'll be back tomorrow with more of The Excerpt from USA Today.